Hi again. So we are continuing our discussion about bonding theories and really looking into the heart of the matter, which is the shape of molecules. The theory that determines the shape of molecules is something called VSEPR theory. VSEPR theory stands for valence shell electron pair repulsion. Think of what that wording means. Valence shell, so the outermost, so the ones that are involved in the bonds, those electrons are in pairs and they will repel each other. That is how we determine the shape of the molecule. And as we can see over here, the shape of a molecule is really important in determining how it functions. In a solution, in a biological cell, the shape of the molecule is going to tell us whether it's polar, whether it will dissolve in water, what type of intermolecular forces it has. So it's really important. In the VSEPR model, the structure around a given atom depends mostly on minimizing electron pair repulsion. Remember, electrons are negative, like charges repel. So those electrons are going to try and get as far apart as possible. One thing that is key is that double and triple bonds are counted just like regular single bonds. I'm going to start calling them electron domains. Electron domain, think of the word domestic. We've talked about this before. It means that where do the electrons live? So these electron domains are double bonds, triple bonds, single bonds, but also they can be lone pairs. If you look at a molecule like this is that methane molecule that we just talked about. It has 4 bonds coming off of the central atom. Those 4 bonds are exactly the same because they use sp3 hybridized orbitals. And those bonds contain electrons. Electrons repel each other. They try to get as far apart from each other as possible. And that's how we get 109.5 degrees in between the bonds. What about a molecule like NH3, ammonia? That is a lone pair on the central atom. So think about this lone pair here still repelling the other electrons in the bonds. So even though you can't see the electron pair, these bonds still repel as if because there are 4 electron domains around it. In a bent molecule such as water, and we'll go over the names, like how did I know it was called bent? That's what we're doing next. You can see that there's 4 electron domains, but 2 of them are lone pairs. That doesn't matter. The 4 still separate as far apart as possible, like in the tetrahedron. So here's how you're going to find the shape of a molecule. Step 1, you've got to draw the Lewis dot structure. That's the big guy. Once you draw the Lewis dot structure, you count the total number of electron domains. So what exactly are we counting as an electron domain? So obviously, maybe not obviously, a single bond, a double bond, a triple bond. All of those count as one. It's one region where the electrons are going to go in between the 2 atoms. A resonance bond will also just count as 1. So if you're writing it as like this, that is still just counted as 1 electron domain. And then, as we just said, a lone pair counts as 1 electron domain. And then you're going to look at the table. And on the table, you will compare the number of electron domains and how many of those electron domains are lone pairs. And the table will tell you what is the shape of the molecule. These shapes have very specific names, and yes, you do need to learn these shapes and these names. Let's take a look at 3 shapes before we look at the big table. If there are 2 bonds and no lone pairs around the central atom, you can see that here are the electron domains. They try and get as far apart from each other as possible. That's going to be 180 degrees. And the name for this shape is going to be linear, right? And that's not too hard to remember because it's going to look like a line. If there are 3 bonds and no lone pairs, then those 3 bonds will try to get as far apart from each other as possible. And that will kind of look like a triangle. It is where those bonds are 120 degrees apart. And the name for that structure is trigonal planar. You can see the example of BH3. And then here's tetrahedral. We've seen this a few times. Tetrahedral is where there are 4 bonds or 4 electron domains, but none of them are lone pairs. And we call that structure tetrahedral. The bond length, the bond angle is 109.5 degrees. And when we draw it on a piece of paper, it's difficult to draw now because this is in 3 dimensions. So we start with the central atom, and then there's 2 outside atoms that are in the plane of the paper. And then there will be one that goes backwards into the paper, and then this one that comes out of the paper. But all of them this is a perfectly symmetrical molecule, and it will be 109 degrees. This is very different than what the structure looks like when we draw it as a Lewis dot structure. Remember, when we draw Lewis dot structures, we are drawing them flat on a piece of paper. And in real life, these are 3D. So in class, I will show you the 3D models of these molecules so you can get a better picture of what these look like in 3D. So here is the big table. And yes, you do need to learn this table. And I promise you, students have done it before you. You can do it. So the first group is, and it's not really a group, is if there are 2 electron domains. So think of that like over here. There's a central atom and there's 2 things coming off of it. We would say that that is a linear molecule, right? The shape of that molecule is linear. The hybridization, so I also put the hybridization on this table. The hybridization is sp3. The hybridization of this molecule, so the central atom, is sp hybridized. It has 2 identical orbitals made from one s and one p, sp hybridized. The next grouping is if there are 3 electron domains. If there are 3 electron domains, you can have the situation where there's 3 bonds and no lone pairs, or 2 bonds and 1 lone pair, and those have different names. If there are 3 bonds and no lone pairs, this is called trigonal planar. This is like the picture that we saw on a previous slide. That bond angle there is 120 degrees. It's sp2 hybridized. If one of those electron domains is a lone pair, then the shape of that molecule is bent. Ozone is an example of this, where that's a bent molecule. The shape is very important when we get to things like polarity. Next on the list are tetrahedral. So this is a big one. A lot of molecules start as tetrahedral. So tetrahedral is if it has 4 electron domains. If it has 4 electron domains and no lone pairs, we call the shape of the molecule tetrahedral. And we've seen that. That's the bond angle of 109.5. If it has 3 bonds and 1 lone pair, right, so it still has 4 electron domains because that adds up to 4, the shape is called trigonal pyramidal. Ammonia, NH3, is an example of this shape. The bond angle actually gets a little bit smaller because the electron will actually repel the bonds a little bit more. So this guy's bond angle is about 107 degrees as opposed to 109.5. And the last one is if it has 2 lone pairs and 2 bonds. This is like water. Water is a bent molecule. Again, the bonding in that molecule gets a little bit smaller, right? So instead of 107 this time, because these electrons are repelling, pushing those bonds together. This bond angle here is about only 104 degrees. But all three of these have sp3 hybridization because what we call the electron domain geometry. How are those 4 electron domains organized? Tetrahedral, 4, as far apart as they can get. But we only see, if we're looking at the molecule and we're only looking at the atoms, like for water that has 2 lone pairs, we would call that bent, because the structure of the atoms themselves, it makes a bent shape. It literally looks like you took a stick and bent it, right? Next on the list, we have the expanded octets, trigonal bipyramidal. It has, if the molecule has 5 electron domains. When it has 5 electron domains and no lone pairs, we call the name of the shape of the molecule trigonal bipyramidal. This, again, you will see this better in 3 dimensions, but the name comes from the fact that there are 2 pyramids on the top and the bottom, and each pyramid has 3 sides. So you can kind of see that like one pyramid would be connecting those guys, and then the other pyramid would be those 3 and the bottom one. Okay, so that's trigonal bipyramidal. The example, if there's 4 electron domains but 1 lone pair, the lone pair always forms on what's called the equatorial position. The equatorial position would be one of these 3 atoms, because if you kind of think of it like a globe, these would be on the equator. The name of that shape is seesaw. You will see in real life when we look at these in 3D that it does look like a seesaw. If it has 3 3 bonds, but 2 of them are lone pairs, that lone pair also gets on the equatorial plane, and we call this T-shaped. And sometimes there can even be where there's just 2 bonds and 3 lone pairs. All the lone pairs would be on that equator, and the name of that shape would be linear, because look at where the atoms are, right? The atoms just still form a straight line. So we would call that linear. And of course, all of these molecules, because they have 5 electron domains, and those 5 electron domains need to be equal, it's sp3 hybridized. And then finally, we have octahedral. Octahedral is when you have 6 electron domains. Students can find that very confusing because they're like, oct means 8. Octahedral means 8 sides. And if you were to like make each, when you see this in 3D, you'll see it. It looks like the top makes a 4-sided pyramid and the bottom makes a 4-sided pyramid, which means in total there would be 8 sides. That's where the name octahedral comes from. Octahedral is when there are 6 electron domains and all of them are bonds. If there's 5 bonds and 1 lone pair, so still a total of 6, it's called square pyramidal, because this looks like a pyramid with a square base, just like the pyramids that we are familiar with in Egypt. And if there are 4 bonds and 2 lone pairs, the lone pairs are opposite each other. And when the lone pairs are opposite each other, the name of the shape is square planar, because all of those remaining atoms are in one plane. And of course, this is sp3d2 hybridized, because in order to get 6 identical electron domains, we need to use 1 s, 3 p's, and 2 d's, so sp3 hybridized. What we will do in the next video is do a whole bunch of these practice problems using this table in order to figure out what is the shape of the molecule.